to talk about chronic heat stress. Okay, so here are three objectives, and one of them is review. We've already talked about acclimation and acclimatization, but I want to recap that. And so here we go. So acclimation and acclimatization, what's the difference? Acclimation occurs in an artificial environment, okay? And so this is where we go hang out in the chamber for a while. Acclimatization is we're out in the real world, okay? So we moved to Phoenix this time of year, where it will not be snowing on Wednesday. All right. So these adaptations take a little bit of time to occur, and they really start to occur if we experience chronic heat exposure lasting anywhere from a week and a half to 2 weeks. And this is important as well, is that it requires about 100 minutes of exercise every day. Okay. If you're not in the heat for as many days, or if you don't exercise as much in the heat, this acclimatization will occur. It will just take longer. So what are the effects of acclimation or acclimatization to the heat? There are 5 things that you can look for. Okay. So those include increased plasma volume, increased stroke volume, and decreased heart rate. We become more effective at sweating, and we reduce our core temperature. Okay. The ultimate goal is to improve heat loss. All right. So let's talk about each of these for just a minute. So increased plasma volume. So this means we're holding on to water. We're going to have more fluid in our bloodstream, so we'll have greater plasma. Okay. Now there can be some downsides to that. We can reduce our hematocrit, which means there's less oxygen available per volume of blood, but it also allows us to better cool ourselves off. Helps maintain blood pressure, which is important, especially during exercise. It also gives us the opportunity to lose more water via sweating, and we do this by producing more plasma proteins. Okay. Remember, plasma proteins are found in the plasma. They don't leave the bloodstream unless there's some sort of issue. And the job of a plasma protein is to hold on to water. So if I produce more plasma proteins, I'm going to hold on to water more easily. Okay. And so as a result, I'll be able to maintain blood pressure and have kind of a bigger capacity to sweat. Now, the stroke volume heart rate thing, they go together, right? We've talked about this several times throughout the semester and as well as in 220. So ultimately, by doing this, the heart is going to be more efficient, meaning the heart rate will be lower for a given intensity. And so we're comparing acclimatized or acclimated to unacclimatized. And as a result, if our heart rate's lower for a given intensity, we're not going to hit our heart rate max until we reach a high intensity or higher intensity. Okay. Next, we have sweating. Okay, now I want you to take a minute and look at this graph. Now there are 3 distinct things, or 3 things that are distinctly different between these 3 lines. And I want you to take a minute and see if you can identify those 3 things. So the first one is we'll begin to sweat at a lower temperature. So if we're acclimated, we sweat earlier. This allows us to have a lower core temperature as we go throughout exercise. Okay, so our threshold is lower. 2, our sweat rate is increased. Okay, and so what's happening is for a given temperature, we're sweating more. Okay, and then 3, our sweat sensitivity increases. And so for a given amount of sweat, we're lowering our temperature. We're more efficient at keeping a lower temperature. So we're sweating more, but we're sweating more effectively, more efficiently. So we're able to maintain that low body temperature. So ultimately, and finally, this leads to reduced core temperature. Reduced core temperature. Sorry about that. Had to sneeze. All right. There is some evidence to suggest that when we get around 40 or 40.5 degrees, that bad things start to happen. Okay, proteins start to break down. We have issues, and there's just tissue damage. Okay, now whether or not this is real is debated. There's evidence out there to suggest people will get a higher core temperature than 40 degrees, and it's not that big of a deal. But some people say, hey, 40 degrees or some other critical temperature where if we hit this value, death is almost certain or damage is almost certain to happen. So let's just go on the assumption that there is some critical core temperature. Well, if it is, what's the benefit of having a reduced resting core temperature? Okay, and hopefully you realize that we just have more time before we reach that temperature, right? If I'm at 37 and I only have to get to 40, that means I have a buffer of 3 degrees. But if after acclimatization, my core temperature is now 36.5, well, I've gained an extra half a degree buffer, which means I can go exercise at a higher intensity for a longer period of time in the heat. And so those are a basic overview of the changes that occur due to chronic heat exposure.